Hi, I'm going to talk a little bit about project ideas that are close to home. As you can see, I'm at a short walk from a home base. I'm in a really recent residential area. And there are lots of neighborhoods around Olympia like this where you have recent residential areas with specific types of plantings along the streets and gardens, and some sort of replicate sort of housing designs. And this actually makes for an interesting urban ecological gradient. You can actually move through neighborhoods looking at neighborhood age and plantings and questions like this, and correlate those, look for relationships between those variables and certain plants or wildlife. So we're going to move through a little bit of this gradient and then move to another end of it in just a minute. Okay, I'm along another point of this walk, and as you can see, a lot of these developments have retention ponds, and there's a lot of other small natural wetlands in this kind of urban residential environment that could be the source of lots of questions. You'll see a lot of variation in the types of birds using these sorts of ponds, depending on how long they stay full of water during the breeding season, and vegetation attributes around the edges. And so this is a fairly large one, but as you can see, it's fairly well maintained, and there's not a lot of emergent vegetation in there.
It's going.
Okay, so I'm still in this really recent residential development. This is not too far from the Evergreen State College, and a lot of these areas don't seem to have a lot of necessarily interesting stuff going on, but when you stop and look, they actually really are pretty interesting. Here's a small woodlot. Most of these spaces have small little green belts, either around water areas, or this is just on a little hill. And I can stop and listen for a minute. And there are a lot of birds in this little green space. This is like a little island of more natural habitat. And I can hear downy woodpecker, I can hear pine siskin, I can hear dark-eyed junco. And actually within this little woodlot, there are Pacific wrens that you don't see at all in the rest of this developed neighborhood. Often along these edges also we have invasive species like the Scots broom. And so looking at the types of vegetation that you might encounter in these areas, native, invasive, ornamental, and looking at how insects or birds are preferring different types could be an interesting basis for a question. Okay, you can stop it now. You should see the time start to go up.
Yeah, it's going.
Okay, and so also along a residential or urban suburban gradient, you'll find apartment complexes and townhouses, and they actually have their own difference in structure that might be interesting to compare to single family housing units. Many of them have landscaping around them, some ornamental, some really focus on natives. That could be interesting to look at for a variety of studies. But all of this that I've been talking about is within a 1/4 of a mile walk down a sidewalk. Okay, thanks. Okay, now I've crossed the street into another subdivision, and I'm just circling around so you can see the difference. You can really see the difference in the age of these developments by looking at the trees that are here. They've had some time to grow up and develop, and you can actually detect really big differences in the birds that are here. They're actually coniferous forest birds, pretty common in this neighborhood because of these large, mostly Douglas fir, but some other trees. And so this really does represent a gradient of development age. And you might make predictions if you're looking at plantings in a newer versus an older development that are similar. You might be looking at what they call a chronosequence. You'd have to try and control as much as possible for the sizes of the lots and some other elements, but often you can find enough areas that are similar enough that you could be asking those sorts of questions. Okay, and here we are now in another residential area green space. It so happens that this green space is surrounded by an older housing development with taller trees. And the plantings in this area, many more of these plantings are native tree species. You can see behind me a number of native tree species, and then over here you can see a Pacific madrone, and you can also see salal, and that's part of the landscaping in this development. And so looking at those sorts of differences in green spaces and urban areas could be interesting, and then taking into account what we call the matrix around those green spaces. And so in this case, it's residential areas of different types would be your matrix. You can look and see how permeable, they call a matrix more or less permeable to crossing. And so this is a matrix. If you look at all the tall trees, and if you were to hear the birds singing, the difference between this green space and the neighborhood is very small. And it's a very permeable matrix because the environment around this green space is much more similar to the green space than it was in that newer residential development. Okay, and so here I am in another nearby residential area. As you can see, the houses are much more densely packed. However, so within a much smaller area, there's many more housing plots. And then there's a fairly large designated wetland at the back here that we're going to look at. And so comparing these sorts of metrics also could be interesting for a field ecology project if you're living around sort of a suburban residential area. Okay. Again, along this neighborhood walk, there are areas where basically houses went up here and there over time. And what tended to happen, like the house behind me, is older houses tended to be smaller with large lots of land. That's what people were looking for after World War II. And so comparing these differences in the housing patterns also could be an interesting field ecology project just around this yard. And we have some native and non-native species here, but there are quite a lot of birds using the gardens around here, including, you can hear a dark-eyed junco. Okay, final stop of this neighborhood walk. And I'm at houses that are older that back onto the new development that I was talking about at the very beginning. And so looking at that gradient, you could cross that gradient in areas that are accessible like roads and make comparisons.